Scorched earth is a tactic that is used by fighters, including Islamic State, in Iraq to obscure the views of coalition forces that may be attacking them. I'll go into that later, but what I want to talk about is the human impact of war. And apologies for reading from my laptop. So I'm here to talk about the humanitarian crisis. Those two words have been used again and again when covering Iraq and the recent Mosul offensive. We've been told that over 1 million people could be displaced, that ISIS are using children as suicide bombers and human shields, and that innocent civilians are being killed in the crossfire. But on TV, the push to tell the political and military story in a world of 24-hour news journalism means that sometimes hearing from those who are suffering can take an unintentional backseat. So that's what we wanted to do. Our small team of Vice News journalists went to Iraq specifically to focus on the human impact of war. So the first camp that we went to for internally displaced people was called the Debaga camp. It is outside of Mosul and probably about an hour drive away from Erbil in northern Iraq. We went there in the first week of the offensive. The battles between ISIS and Kurdish and Iraqi forces in the area around Mosul meant that there were already streams of internally displaced people beginning to appear. But at this camp, there were already thousands of people who'd been there for months, so it was already crowded. On the day that we went, we were told that 500 people had arrived from an ISIS-controlled city called Huwayja. Many of them had been forced to leave not because of the fighting, but because they were starving. There was no food and no medicine because the routes in and out of Huwayja were blocked. And I think many other villages around Mosul were suffering the same thing. The first people we spoke to were women. We wanted to hear from them. But many of them refused to speak to us on camera because they still had family members in Mosul and they were afraid of revenge attacks by ISIS. They told us that ISIS forced the men to grow their beards long, forced the women to wear a face veil, wouldn't let them smoke or listen to music, and that they would punish anyone who didn't follow the rules. One woman told us that ISIS fighters had whipped her brother 150 times after they accused him of trying to escape. There were a lot of young girls at the camp. Many of them hadn't been to school for over 2 years. A few of them that I'd met were around 8 or 9 years old, and they were completely illiterate because they'd stopped going to school at such an important stage in their development. And remember, this is a country which once took pride in its literacy levels. It was a country where it wasn't rare for a woman to hold predominantly male-dominated jobs, and yet here I was in a camp where some children couldn't even spell their name. Most of the arrivals had walked 12 or 13 hours to get to the camp, and there were some very old people and some very young people among them. They stuck to a narrow route, travelling in the evening to avoid ISIS attacks. When they arrived at the camp, everyone was registered and their IDs were checked. The women were allowed to go through into the camp, but a lack of space meant that some of them slept on the floor of an open yard. Some of them didn't even have mattresses for the first night. The men, on the other hand, were kept separately in a holding area, surrounded by a fence, away from their families. And that's because officials want to screen them first and make sure that ISIS fighters aren't concealing themselves among the civilians. But what we found were men who'd been detained there for days and even weeks. One told us he'd been held there for over 40 days. We watched wives and family members pass over food, and even children, to the men who couldn't leave. Security is, of course, a big problem, one that can't be ignored for officials, but the men we spoke to insisted that they were the victims, and they'd become victims twice, once by ISIS and now at these camps. One 22-year-old boy told us that we just didn't understand the reality of what they'd lived through. They'd been insulted, his words, by ISIS, and now they were being held in a place that some of them called a cemetery for the living. When I asked about his hope for the future, he said he simply wanted to be free, to walk freely. And this happened with a lot of people. When I'd say to them, what are your hopes for the future? When you ask a child here, they'll talk about what job they want to do, where they want to go. These people would say to us, we just want our homes back. We just want to live freely. After visiting the camps, we also went to a town called Kayara. US-led coalition forces had previously helped to clear the area of ISIS fighters in preparation for the battle to retake Mosul. But in an effort to block the view of the coalition jets, ISIS had set many of the area's oil well alight. It's known as a scorched earth tactic. Before they left, they also looted hospitals, the main hospital in Kayara, taking anything of value. It's been over 2 months since that battle, but ISIS's legacy lives on. When we were there, the hospital was closed, the clinic was bare, equipment was stained black from the soot, and the doctors told us they just didn't have enough medicine to treat people. On top of all of that, the oil wells were, and still are, burning. We watched children play football under plumes of smoke and just hang out around the burning wells. In fact, we discovered that there were many families who were still living just meters away from these huge, burning, toxic fires. They told us that when the wind blew the smoke in their direction, they suffocated. Every single family, without question, every single family we spoke to complained of health problems. The authorities and the coalition told us, Vice News, that the humanitarian crisis is a priority. But the locals of Kayara said they felt neglected, they felt stuck, they felt abandoned. They were desperate to speak to us, and they did speak to us. But they also told us that they'd lost faith, and that they didn't think any of the interviews with Vice News or anyone else would actually help them. Person after person told us they had difficulty breathing. They would cough until they were sick. They said they just stopped going to the clinic because they were tired of being sent away without any treatment. Doctors in the area told us they were concerned about the possible long-term effects of fumes, and other aid organisations verified what we'd seen. They said the same thing, that they were afraid of what the long-term impact, as well as the short-term impact, would be. The children we saw were covered in soot. Their parents would tell us they'd wash them in the morning, and 2 hours later, they were covered in black soot again. Their curtains, their chairs, their floors, everything was stained black. In fact, their sheep was black. It's not an exaggeration. I have photos of the sheep in the local area completely black. Their cows were black. The food that they were eating was contaminated with this toxic soot, and there were even reports that the water had been contaminated. But away from those visible health problems, one mother told us that there were other issues that they were dealing with. When her sons would go out and play, they would pretend to bomb and shoot each other. She said, "What hope do we have? What hope do they have when ISIS hung dead bodies in the street and didn't let the residents take them down?" So many young men approached our team and asked us if we wanted to see videos of the so-called Islamic State. It was clear that the impact of war goes far beyond what's physically visible. For the children of Kayara and Mosul and all the surrounding areas, it will no doubt affect them, not just now, but in the future, and for the generations that will follow them. If you have money, you can leave. If you don't, like many of the residents we met, you can't. You're stuck. They can't afford to rent or buy somewhere further away from the smoke, and they still prefer to live in their homes than the basic camps that I told you about. There's a word that everyone uses in Iraq. Every single person I spoke to, somewhere in the conversation, would say, "mit'awideen." That means we're used to it. Everyone said it. The doctors, the women in the camps, the people breathing the toxic smoke. The residents of Kayara begged us to help them, but in the same breath, they also said they didn't expect much to change. As journalists, our job is to accurately report what we see on the ground. And I felt like we did to some extent, but you're always restrained by time and what we can put out. But away from all of that, we were all deeply affected on a personal level by what we saw. Myself and my colleagues, Cassandra Vinograd and Daniel Bateman, all had moments where we had to stop and take in what we were hearing. So I was born in Iraq. I left when I was around 4 years old, safely on a plane. My dad was about to start a PhD in the UK. It was the time of the Iran-Iraq war, and I think you all know what happened in Iraq following that. But the small town that I'm from looks very much like the towns that I visited. The people in the camp looked like me, looked like my cousins. It struck me that I could have very easily have been them on the other side of the fence, and that they could have been me. And it was just pure chance that it was this way. And the UN says that we haven't seen anything yet, and that once Iraqi and Kurdish forces push into the densely populated areas, there will be an increasing humanitarian crisis, those two words again. But it's very easy for victims to just become numbers. The reality is that civilians are also fighting constant battles away from the front line, in their hospitals, in their homes, and in the camps, and in their schools. And it's vital that their stories are told. Thank you.